Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We are the editors of Where the Leaves Fall magazine, a magazine exploring humankind's connection with nature. We print quarterly and soon we will have an online version of the magazine as well. It's created in conversation with Omved Gardens, and we recommend that you sign up for their newsletter as well as our newsletter.
So this evening, we are delighted to be joined by Margo Farnsworth, a biomimicry educator and author. Margo wrote the feature Biomimicry, Where the Innovation and Nature Meet, which you can read in the current edition of the magazine. You can check on our website. It's www.wheretheleavesfall.com for more details. She's also recently written the book Biomimicry and Business, how companies are using nature's strategies to succeed. So our conversation is going to range across the two publications and some questions around biomimicry, how we can mimic the principles and patterns of life to enhance our own processes. And we will have time at the end to take some of your questions, which you can type in the text box.
Hi Margo.
There, how are you doing,
Margo.
you two?
Hey, good to see you again.
Good to see you and everyone here, even though I'm only seeing pictures.
If you could perhaps just let us know a bit about your life experience and your work experience that led you to biomimicry and exploring that world.
Be happy to. And before I do, I just would like to thank you two, Dave and Lucienne, again for not only for having me, but for putting together such a beautiful magazine and based around such a fabulous concept of exploring that intersection that is the relationship of humans and non-humans on Earth. So I usually refer to myself as a hunter-gatherer. I, like a lot of people, when I went into one job, I gathered tools that I needed there and then still had questions, and that would propel me into my next position. So, you know, I started out working at a backpacking store and becoming a park ranger, later had the title of naturalist, moved into teaching science. And then I working for the government and then working for a corporation and thinking I want to do more, I need to do more for the earth, and how do I do this? And so I became the executive director for a non-government organization working for the health of watersheds. So I've really loved watching your pond series of tweets and Instagrams. And then from there, I became a instructor at university level for sustainability and applying all that I had learned into the business setting, because this was an MBA sustainability program. And it was during that time that I read Janine Benyus's book on biomimicry. And if you ever read any of my work, you'll see me refer to her as the queen. She's where I got my start. And, but it was my students who really got me to write the book and to write more about biomimicry, because they, you know, her book was assigned reading, and then there were other assignments, but then we would come to a point, and time after time, semester after semester, students who didn't know each other would say, but how do we get biomimicry into business? Mm-hmm. And at that point, I thought about all of our case studies and the way we had been approaching biomimicry. And in 2015, I thought, we need to tell stories. That's how we need to approach this, because stories, everyone responds to stories. And some of the most successful businesses have become successful because they know how to tell their stories. So that's, my students are who really inspired the book.
Mm-hmm. So just to understand the concept, so let's start from the concept. So how would you describe biomimicry, and how does it differ from other bio words? So such as bionics, bioutilization, biophilia, biomorphism, and bioinspiration.
There are so many bios. So starting with biomimicry, the way I like to think about it, it's a problem-solving methodology for business, and it exists on a tripod of an ethos of wanting to move from man versus nature to man or human, men and women, and in between with nature. And so there's the ethos. And then there is connecting or reconnecting with nature. You need to observe nature and observe the strategies nature uses to create certain functions or make functions functional. The different strategies they use to shed water or absorb shock, whatever that functional problem is that you're having, nature has solved for it before we ever got here. And of course, the third leg of that tripod is emulating those strategies then to accomplish those functions. Language is so important. And if you don't believe it, you haven't been on the floor of a herpetology conference where multiple parties are fighting over the name of a frog and how it should be changed, or, groundwater conferences, watershed conferences, whatever conferences I've gone to, and I'm guessing that our guests here have encountered the problem of language, even amongst humans. And so the most of us, I would venture to say, think of biomimicry in the way that I've just described. There are others who would describe it a little bit differently. But then we have those other actors, like you just said. We have biophilia, which is really about our connection to nature, our love of nature, and that feeling we get of wholeness when we're in nature, whether it's, if your preferred ecosystem is a forest or a savanna, a desert, a prairie. And so that's biophilia. Bioinspiration is kind of like what Leonardo da Vinci did when he looked at birds and said, I could do something like that, where he makes that physical connection, but doesn't necessarily look deeply into the strategies, or talk about how Earth would respond to those strategies, which we may get into later. Bionics is usually connected with the medical industry and regaining a function of, say, a limb. So emulating something for that kind of a specific purpose. And bioutilization, think of a sheepdog. We use creatures to accomplish tasks, all the time. Some of the companies that are using biomimicry also use bioutilization. I'm thinking of one company in particular that's looking at algae for new ways to create coverings for floors. So they're all out there, and that's just the start of the cousins. There are a group of us who have started using the term biom star. And the reason we use that is because a lot of times when you're working in this field, you will pair up a couple of strategies. There may be 2 or 3 strategies that are used in the solution space, which is okay. it's great in some situations, but it's also important to be really precise with what you mean and know what you're doing when you're doing it, so that you don't make claims that you're doing something that you're really not.
Okay, so I'll just say that if anyone's got any questions, just to type them into the text box, and we'll have time at the end to answer some of them. So you say in your book, biomimicry can be used to earn profits while being kinder to the planet. You say there's the triple bottom line of planet, people, profit. So is that kind of the order of importance, do you think? Could you talk a bit more about the relationship between those three words and the meaning?
Well, for me, that's the order of importance, but I'm not here to judge others who may favor a different order. The important thing, I think, here is to build the intentions of our businesses and really our lives around balancing the three. If I put on my business hat, I have to realize at some point and in very meaningful ways, I have no business if the planet is not livable. I have no business without nature, biologically or physically and chemically from other realms. I have no business without people. And I can have a better business on the flip side by working in partnership with the planet, and better business by caring for and about my employees and my clients in more than a transactional manner. It's to me a matter of compassion and inclusion of all beings. And for me, it's a matter of good sense because I've seen it work in business.
One of the things we talk a lot in our magazine, and we are quite keen to shine a light on, is that the human race is part of nature. When so much of our actions and language seem to separate us. So how does biomimicry fit in with this? And does biomimicry see us as part of nature?
Yes, and it's one of the wonderful things that the three of us have in common, and part of why I'm so happy to be working with you. We each, and certainly the biomimicry methodology, work as a part of and not apart from nature. Here's the thing. All organisms in a given area are part of an ecosystem. We all know this. Humans make huge and often catastrophic changes to our ecosystems that often turn around and bite us, as with flooding in overly built up areas, topsoil loss in areas denuded of vegetation, heat island effects in cities, et cetera, et cetera. Biomimicry can bring us back into, or move us forward, I'll say, into a more positive alignment with nature by asking, how would nature build a city? Or how would nature shed water? And framing it that way with each functional challenge your company or your city is trying to surmount, you can come into a more equitable space, a space of partnership with nature, I should say the rest of nature, while solving your problems. In addition to profits gained by the companies whose stories I tell in your magazine and in the book, they each come into better balance with nature in some way or in multiple ways, whether by reducing energy or water consumption, or building on more life-friendly chemistry like Nike did, or shedding unwanted bacteria instead of killing it like Sharklet does.
I'm just going to jump on as we are talking about companies. Is there a risk that companies could use biomimicry for good in one aspect of their work improving their systems, optimizing an aspect of their business, creating or refining a product, but continue to cause damage and suffering with another part, such as human rights or nature abuses.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think of most of life as a bell curve, and certainly in business, where I spend a lot of my time. You know, there's bad people doing evil things over here on one end, and then there's all the people who are learning and doing more and better things. And then you get into the other end where, you know, people are doing excellent things for, you know, purely philanthropic reasons. So the bulk of us, you know, lies somewhere in the middle. And so a long time ago, when I was working with water health, we were working with developers, and a lot of environmentalists tended to think of developers as just being sent from a bad place to be a scourge on the earth. And one of my board members gave me a saying. It said, "Collaborate or die." And I really took that to heart and began thinking about what I call a continuum of care. And that is that we would welcome developers into our realm and collaborate with them if they were taking any steps in a positive relationship. Now, what would happen is that we would work more with those companies who were moving forward along that continuum of care. That was where the richness of collaboration was. Those were the people that we put forth for governor's awards and Environmental Protection Agency awards. And those were the people that we held up to the public as the companies that you wanted to emulate. If you were just going to noodle around on this end, you know, come to our workshops, you know, make those decisions to get better. But where the richness really happened was down at the other end of the spectrum, is moving, and with those people who are wanting to move forward. I don't think that we have any business, you know, condemning people, because people are going to do what they do. But if we can help them, then help each other, we might all do better.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen recently like a bit of a sea change in attitudes of companies, corporations, to wanting to adapt themselves to, I guess, I don't know, we're at a time where obviously because of the COVID and I guess politically as well, there's been a lot of upheaval, and within that space there's a lot of opportunity for, I suppose you could say, rebirth or rethinking or reorganization. Do you think people are maximizing or taking that on?
Or optimizing?
Optimizing.
You know, it's interesting that you asked that question, and I think it's a really fabulous question, and probably deeper than we could. This would be great for all of us to be able to talk about here, because so many things have happened, and I think they've, you know, converged in a kind of a nexus from the business angle, from the political angle, from what's happening with climate change, and it's all coming into play. From staying in my own lane, sort of in the biomimicry lane, you know, one of the things, the humps that we were trying to get over was materials, because creating products with life-friendly materials, with a minimum number of elements and complexity, with elements that are not toxic, with elements that can biodegrade and be used in a circular fashion, has been a real challenge. But more and more lately, we're seeing new gains being made in those areas. And so it's really exciting. And at the same time, to address a little bit more of what you're saying, I think we're seeing an openness to that. I'm seeing changes in people's corporate sustainability reports to reflect more earnest change, more what I'll call real change, as opposed to just FaceTime greenwashing.
Okay, and for these businesses that are interested in biomimicry, is it scalable, like a one-man or one-person business, for example, or a big corporation, or even perhaps on a governmental level? Is there space for biomimicry in all of the situations?
Absolutely. And, you know, in your magazine, I talked a little about Encycle. Encycle started with two guys, and they knew that they wanted to do something in the realm of energy. They couldn't quite decide what. They had a bunch of ideas that they'd thrown on the table. And then the blackout happened in Southeast Canada and Northeast US. And they went, energy management, this is where we're going. And now they're a multinational company. Now, I throw up my hand like that, like it happened overnight, which it did not. And I think that that's one of the places that we get stuck when we are looking at any kind of sustainability practices in business, regenerative practices in businesses. You know, if it does, we get bummed out when it doesn't just happen overnight. But that's not how business operates. You know, business operates sometimes with a big idea, and you get some real forward motion, and then you hit a plateau. A lot of times when you're looking for the capital to take your business to the next step, it's not just a, okay, we're making headway in a continual kind of thing. Like most of life, it operates in fits and starts. So, but again, in the book, I talk about two well-known multinationals. Nike is one, Interface Carpets is the other, but the other three all started small, like what you're asking.
Let's jump to a question here. Can we ask about your ideas regarding biomimicry and the circular economy from Dominic?
Well, certainly. I mean, if you think of a forest and what happens there, you know, biomimicry operates around every planet has its own operating conditions, and Earth is no different. And then, so things like gravity governs what we do here, and you know, sunshine, and the fact that we have to have water. So there's certain things that form a context for how things operate here that we pretty much have to comply with, or at least if we're going to be wanting to be energy and water efficient, and so on and so forth, material efficient. Then we need to comply with those things. And then there are life's principles that are a little bit more fine-tuned. And one of those is all about cycles. And we have cycles in day and night, in seasons, you know, that we could spend a whole day just talking about cycles. But when you look at how a forest operates with, you know, the leaves forming part of the nutrients, and then, you know, things eat them and die there and form further nutrients, and then the tree uptakes that, and we have blooms again, and you go and you pick an apple from the tree. That is a circular, you know, sort of model. And so that within whatever problems you're solving, because you're looking to be use life-friendly chemistry, so you're automatically sort of in that opera of being biodegradable, your product being biodegradable, to be used and used again, you know, is one of the things that Interface Carpets has looked at. They would really love to lease carpets instead of sell carpets, so that when companies are done with them, and these carpet squares, by the way, that I'm talking about, were modeled on the pattern of the non-pattern of the forest floor and how leaves look when they're on the forest floor, which rocketed, when they mimicked that, it rocketed that division to being their top selling division. But they would love to lease carpet, and so that they can chew it up and spit it out again as a new carpet. So, and they are looking at materials more closely all the time. So, Dominic, I don't know if that satisfied your answer, but I hope so.
So I'm going to get a quote here from Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who describes herself as a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. So she said, getting scientists to consider the validity of indigenous knowledge is like swimming upstream in cold water. So our question is there space within biomimicry to take on board indigenous knowledge?
I mentioned earlier connecting or reconnecting to nature. So in many ways, indigenous people across the globe were the original biomimics. Think about those planet operating conditions I just mentioned. Indigenous people studied and relied on those patterns and conditions to put food on the table, but in a way that wouldn't deplete them. They were resource and material efficient with every single part of an animal harvested in a hunt. They accessed resources locally and were locally attuned and adapted to changing conditions. They were the original, what I call sustainabilists. So if humans moving around the globe would have treated indigenous people they encountered with respect and the partnership that we've talked about before, we wouldn't have to be using the word regenerative, because we would have already been learning from them and applying those things. Still, there's no time like the present. And right now, I'm very hopeful. I'll be working with a group soon. We put in a grant to build riverside food forests that will help with food insecurity and also help slow down storm flow and help infiltrate the water back into the ground. So it's going to depend on what our tribal partners, say and how they want to move forward with it. And of course, also will depend on the grant.
Can you say where that's going to be?
We are fortunate enough to be, I love making partnerships, especially where there have been challenges in the past. And so my first university that I went to was in Missouri, and they've always had a sort of a rivalry with Kansas. And so we have professors from each school now partnering together on this. And they have worked with tribes all around the central part of North America, in Kansas, Iowa, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri. And so again, we will listen to what our indigenous partners have to say, and then we'll build it based on that.
Amazing. There's one question here from Matt Nicholson. Are nature solutions documented anywhere? Like, how do you find the right bio solution for your functional problem?
Yeah, I wonder if Matt already knows about Ask Nature. That question just is so perfect that it's almost a setup for me. There's a number of people who are writing books, and so you can find out certain things from those. AskNature.org is a wonderful resource that really lets you attack a problem through a taxonomy of these functions. So you can look up, if you need to shed water, then you can look up, shedding something. If you need to enclose something, you can look it up based on that. And it'll not only give you certain organisms that have, accomplished these functions, but if there are companies that are already using those solutions, they'll give you a link to, or at least the name of those companies as well. And of course, I think I saw Kai Constantini is on this call. She is a biomimicry colleague, and I know that, either of us would be, happy to help if people have specific questions. We would try to get them further.
How is it best for people to get in touch? On your website?
Yeah, that's a great way.
Okay. So jumping back a bit, you talked a bit about the cycle, the sun, when we touched on the cyclical question. In your book, you talk about the idea of wildness. So we're with sunlight, water, gravity, limits and boundaries, dynamic non-equilibrium, and cyclic processes. Can you talk a bit more about this?
I said a few words earlier, but really it is just looking at the conditions our planet has that drives how things work. Sunlight drives most growth, of course, not the deep sea that is driven chemically. Water drives life. Our bodies are over 3/4 water. We have the cycles that I was talking about before. The point is, these operating conditions are the context within which we do everything, including our companies operating. It's everything we do at work, at play, at home. If we work within these operating conditions, we are much more able to expend less energy, use fewer resources, etc., whether in the wild or in the city, or in the in-between. And all those things make us better partners to other life on Earth. And there's another lesson for us. If we study how organisms operate within these boundaries, we can accomplish work tasks without having to reinvent the wheel and spend that time. The rest of nature has so many lessons to teach us, from these operating conditions to the principles I was talking about. Even our own human bodies and how they operate function by function can be a classroom if we just step through the door.
And so as a first question that people could ask, rather than perhaps sort of what can I take from nature, what can I observe and process, what can I utilize or use, what if people ask the question, what can I give to nature? Is that something that could fall within the realms of biomimicry to an extent?
I love your questions. This was central to Ray Anderson, who was the CEO of Interface Carpets. And it came about because he read a book. Daniel Quinn wrote a book called Ishmael. And in that book, there were givers and there were takers. And this was one of the two books that changed the carpeting industry because it changed Ray. And once he was confronted with that statement, he didn't ask the question, he made the decision. He wanted to give, and he wanted his company to do so as well. And that was a very important part of his journey toward biomimicry. As to the question itself, I think we can approach it in a number of ways, but business professionals are very used to goal setting. And what I talk about in the book is, instead of setting your goals first, try setting your intentions first. What are your intentions? To be a giver or a taker, to do no harm, to win every time, or practice compassion. There are a whole lot of intentions. It's very easy to say, well, my intention is to build widgets and sell them. But what I'm suggesting is that's more of a goal. And if you step back and think about what are my intentions, then I think you end up being a more successful company, because you operate from a place of belief, from values, from passion, and then you can move into your goal setting and be much more, pardon me, intentional about your goal setting. So that's what I would say, and clearly he did that, and clearly they are a very successful company.
Mm.
Mhm.
So in your book, you discuss how nature doesn't maximizes, it optimizes. So how this can be translated to business?
Nature is so very careful with energy, because energy requires some kind of nutrient input. Nature becomes very efficient with how it goes about business, because there's a high cost for nutrient acquisition. One of the quickest routes to getting a grip around this idea is to think about additive manufacturing, 3D printing, versus traditional methods. In additive manufacturing, we are optimizing, because we're using only what we need. There's no waste on the cutting room floor, or very little. You've cut it down a lot. And that's all because of optimization. Maximization can yield wasted energy, stock overages, market gluts, all kinds of things. That's more Kai's department. You can also consider the other end of things, reuse, recycling of materials, and, really where Dominic's mind was in terms of that circular economy. Looking at barn swallows, we see them taking grass and feathers and creating little mud pellets out of the mud. So they are using what's already there. And that is a way that businesses can optimize, is look at your problem from a different direction. And is there anything there that you can use? Is there anything that the company next door is getting rid of as what they call waste that you can use to power your company? And so those are some ways that we can be more circular.
We took part in a webinar from the Omved Gardens and the Chef's Manifesto earlier, and there was a restaurant talking about how they basically tried to maximize their processes, and part of that was how they approach and talk with local organizations they buy the produce from, but then they can also return compost to them, for example. That kind of relationship, I think it's quite beautiful. And yeah, it's something definitely on a local level, and perhaps even national, maybe if it's possible on an international level. Yeah, it'd be lovely to see more of that.
Beautiful and exciting, because we can build our communities better with them, and those opportunities for collaboration, like we were talking about earlier, are some of the richest relationships that I've had in business anyway.
Mhm.
For sure. So going back to the maximization, this is something that quite often capitalism has been accused of rather than optimization. So if nature is based on optimization, is it a quiet aim of biomimicry in a way to quietly reshape capitalism into a more optimistic, optimized form?
You know, there is a temptation to answer an important question like that in a glib manner because our challenges are so immediate and so incredibly massive and significant that they tend to put us in a space. Well, Barry Lopez was in conversation with Robert McFarlane recently, two writers that I very much admire. And unfortunately, Mr. Lopez has recently passed. But they put us in a place that Mr. Lopez talks about as existential loneliness because we are unable to say what we can't bear. And so many times, and we're looking at rates of depression. Some of it's COVID related, but a lot of it is also related to climate. And so we brush these things off with a joke or with a rhetorical question like, what are you going to do? And of course, capitalism isn't just about dollars and cents. It intersects with politics and power as well, whether we like it or not. So you've asked a very big question, but I will answer you earnestly. We must learn to speak the language of the planet and act based on the well-being of all. One of the most efficient and effective ways to do that is by learning lessons our non-human neighbors have to teach. Some of my biomimicry colleagues, like Kai, work with business, but business and indeed capitalism or whatever ism you favor doesn't exist in a vacuum. With that in mind, I have biomimicry colleagues who are working as entrepreneurs in nonprofit organizations, in schools, and other centers for learning. I have biomimicry colleagues who are designers, who are engineers, government officials, and we're active in all these realms because of our various backgrounds and because the challenges we have. And when you're trying to do something as important as showing humans how to partner with non-human neighbors who have been here far longer than we have, you have to approach it at many levels. And so I guess I wouldn't limit it to capitalism and the other isms. I would say we have to go beyond.
Answer.
We have a few comments here. Would you like to read them?
Yeah, so Benjamin says, let's start with this one. Thank you. Does biomimicry need to put a cap on the growth of businesses for them to be fully optimized? Too much growth and taking can't be sustainable.
Yeah, that's a big challenge for us as humans, isn't it? There is a percentage of humans on Earth that don't believe that, continued growth is a problem, and that's a problem. And that is part of this this question of optimization. Yeah, if you, I think I said in the book something about if humans continued to grow and grow and grow, and suddenly you had a 20-foot human, and then you look at, okay, well, what does it take to feed that 20-foot human or clothe that 20-foot or house? It's the same thing with a company. The bigger you get, the more food it needs. And so, just in a practical realm, you can get into problems with that. And whether I've been working with the government, and people talk about, oh, well, we don't want big government. One of the reasons people don't want big government is because it gets inefficient when it gets too big. The same thing that I've talked to with friends, and I won't name names of companies, but with companies that are the uber large companies, they get to a certain point and it can become not as efficient or effective a business. There can be failings that sometimes can be ignored or absorbed, and then other times they can't. But I think to get to the crux of the question, of course we should be putting limits on ourselves. I don't think biomimicry is going to have the power to make caps, but certainly I think common sense should.
Kai says here, business by definition is social and as such needs to relearn a different connection with its environment. So I think this is just underlining the point that you were making earlier.
Yeah. With regard to the continuum of care and how it is connected to biomimicry, I talk about economic practicality as being on this end of the spectrum of reciprocity, and then moving into social reciprocity, and at the far end, when you're really there, then we're talking about environmental reciprocity. And there are those companies, believe it or not, who are in that realm. They are buying land for land's sake, to protect the organisms that are there.
I think I have maybe I'll ask my last question, then we open for that one. So how can a business get started with biomimicry?
Well, it depends on your intentions. And it depends on where you are in your business. We've talked, someone asked the great question about where can they learn more about organisms. And so Ask Nature is a product of the Biomimicry Institute, which is a nonprofit educational organization that teaches biomimicry and also holds contests for entrepreneurs and issues a challenge every year with a great big cash prize for the entrepreneurs that are the winners. The Biomimicry used to be Guild. Biomimicry 3.8 is a for-profit that does consulting with businesses. A lot of these businesses, let's see, Pack Scientific came about because Jay was just curious about the natural world. He hung out on the beach all the time and started looking at patterns. And as he grew up and he cared for nature, he knew that there were ways to put those patterns into play. And so he was kind of self-taught, although he picked people's brains. He's a big believer in engaging with the experts. And so, there's that way to start. Ray, when he finally found biomimicry, it was by listening to a talk and then getting in touch with Dana Baumeister, who is Janine's partner, business partner, and then bringing Biomimicry 3.8 to his company to work with him. There are a number of consulting firms now that will help you with that. Certainly, I would help anyone here in any way I can, whether it's to steer you in the right direction for your particular intention and set of goals. And of course, there's reading books. And I've got a whole list in one of the back chapters of all kinds of resources where you can go. So there's lots of different ways into that world.
So Matt, going back to the discussion about, the caps that businesses might have as they expand. He's asking, so do consumers have to get used to a less comfy lifestyle in a biomimicked world?
I think in a world where we want to address and need to address climate change, we all need to be making adjustments. And whether it's turning off the light when we leave the room, whether it's sweeping the walk instead of spraying it with water, there are a number of ways that we have to get used to doing things differently as consumers. Now, there are companies, and I'll use Patagonia as an example. Eileen Fisher is another, where they now have product lines of slightly used garments so that the garments don't go straight to the bin. They get recycled again. And then Yvonne, the CEO of Patagonia, I don't know if he's CEO or now like CEO emeritus or whatever, but he started the company, has an ad that says, "Don't buy this shirt." And his argument, he's not being glib. What he's saying is that, hey, if we're building a better product, that's no excuse for you to go out and buy 3 refrigerators. So it's very much on businesses, but also on consumers. And so it's another thing where we have to collaborate. We have to work together and, try to live on this planet in a less intrusive style.
Mm-hmm. Dominic has a couple of questions here. Can you give any case study examples of biomimicry being used in biophilic urbanization?
Yes, Lavasa, India is, I think, one of the first places that the Biomimicry 3.8 worked. And they were confronted with flooding there. And so they looked at the drip tips of leaves and integrated that into the architectural plans. They also looked at pathways for ants and looked at the grooves that would operate sort of like gutters, but in a more optimized way. Also, there's another biomimic that was working in an area of poverty. And they had an amount of money, and they said, where would be the best place to invest this money? And in ecosystems in the wild, the places where one ecosystem, say a forest, meets another ecosystem, say a meadow or a prairie, right there at that juncture, that's where life is richest. That's where the big, bold, badass stuff is happening. And so the answer they came up with from a biomimetic standpoint was invest that money in an area where the poverty-stricken area butts up against the less poverty-stricken area. And part of that is because then you have organisms, humans in this case, from both areas interfacing with each other. So you're creating the start of a dialogue. And Juan, the person who did this, could probably explain it much more elegantly than that because he was the one involved in the project. But it was an amazing application, I thought.
There's another question here from Dominique. Are there any case study examples where biomimicry is good in theory, but may have been challenging or even failed in practice?
Sure. So many, so much of what we learn, and it doesn't matter if we're learning from nature or if we're learning chemistry, we're humans, we make mistakes. and we didn't apply the knowledge that we've learned in the correct way. Also in business, as probably most of our listeners know here, there's timing in the market. There's having enough capitalization. There are a lot of hobgoblins, if you will, to overcome in business. So most of the times that I've seen, in fact, I can't think of a way or a time in an actual company where they've used biomimicry and failed because of the biomimicry. It's been because of the normal reasons businesses have failed. Lack of capitalization is one of the big ones that I can think of. But having said that, I know that there have been companies out there who have applied a biomimetic solution, just like they would have applied any number of other solutions, but it didn't work right, the first time out of the barn. But I'm sorry, I can't give you any examples. It's not because I view biomimicry with rose-colored lenses. I'm telling you, I know there have been cases where it's failed, but my mission on earth is to show you the places where it has not failed so that I can give you a hand up into this realm. And so apologies for not being able to fully answer that question.
I think we've got time for one last question. And I think Matt here, are there any brands or products that you've seen that you feel could easily be reinvented through biomimicry?
If I had a wishing ball and could wish for anything and see promise in it too, it would be in the redesigning of our cities and in moving our entire communities forward. I worked on a model that was looking at how you can deploy the genius of multiple organisms in a way where it's collaborative in and amongst itself, and looking at water management in ways where we can capture floodwater, divert it, store it, and then release it in times of need. I think that holds huge promise.
Great. Well, I think that's come to the end. Thank you, Margo. That's been
so much.
Really inspiring. And thank you, everyone that has joined us.
Thanks, Kai, for the links.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments from everyone.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.